Hi, my name is Tim Jones, Product Specialist of the Hot Water Group with Armstrong International. Today we're going to describe the disassembly and reassembly of the Flo-Rite-Temp water heater control valve. Today we're going to look at the model 665, but no matter if it's the smallest model, model 415, the 535, the 665, or the 8120, the disassembly and reassembly are the same throughout all models. For demonstration purposes, I have eliminated the O-rings and loosened most of the bolts and the set screws. We will reassemble these accordingly and install O-rings and tighten as necessary. The Model 665, our second to largest water heater, the model that we have here, we will take it apart, and I'm going to start by disassembling the top control valve. Now, keep in mind, it's always easier to have the control valve on a workbench. It is not necessary to disassemble or to remove the control valve from the heat exchanger when servicing the upper portion, the top cap and the O-rings, or replacing a diaphragm. We have it here on the workbench. To start off, I'm going to remove the top screws, and I would do this if I had any leaking coming out this top area. I'm going to replace O-rings, or I want to do a complete overhaul on this control valve. A 5/16 Allen wrench will work on a 665. The other models will have corresponding sizes for their cap screws. I can remove the cap screws. The top cap will lift directly up. Knowing that a unit might be somewhat scaled, you could use 2 screwdrivers to pry underneath to pop it up. But once the cap screws are removed, I can then remove the top cap. My low flow adjuster will remove with that top cap. I can then remove my low flow adjuster and separate it from my top cap. Again, you will notice I do not have O-rings here for demonstration purposes. My high flow adjuster will then pull straight out from my restrictor assembly, and I can unthread my restrictor assembly from my stem. Now keep in mind, if that stem is corroded and it does not unthread, we will remove it when we remove the stem from the entire body. Once I have the top cap removed and the upper portion of the valve removed, I then will put the control valve on its front. It's always easier to remove the diaphragm cover with the diaphragm housing laying over the table, as you see here. Once we remove all the diaphragm bolts, we can then remove the diaphragm housing from our main valve, the lower diaphragm housing, which will then expose our main valve spring. We then can replace and remove our diaphragm by unlocking the lock nuts on the bottom of our stem. On a 665, we can use a crescent wrench to hold the upper locking nut and an 1 1/8" open end wrench to unlock those 2 nuts. We can then remove the 2 locking nuts, which will leave us with our diaphragm support disc and our diaphragm. The only sealing surface of the diaphragm area, the diaphragm chamber, is that Viton diaphragm. So in a used water heater, it will be sealed right around this housing. We can typically take a knife or a screwdriver to separate that. We can pull the support disc and the diaphragm away from our stem, which will then leave us with a support disc on the top side of the diaphragm. And we are now able to remove the stem from the control valve itself, which leaves us with our upper valve here. We're now ready to remove the upper diaphragm housing away from the main valve body in the event we have leaking around the lower part of our valve in this area here We can remove our cap screws that hold the upper diaphragm housing to the main valve body. That will pull directly up. We do have an O-ring seal here, so if you do have leaking, we'll want to replace this O-ring. From this point, if you do not have any leaking around my retainer, I can simply take and replace the O-ring around my lower valve. For demonstration purposes, we're going to remove my retainer in the event that you have to completely replace the lower valve in our assembly. So here we have our lower valve, the O-ring, and my retainer. These can be cleaned up on a belt sander or wire wheel, and then you are ready to reassemble. Once you have your control valve disassembled, you will want to clean up your parts, knowing that parts may come out over a used unit that may look like this on a 535 control valve and the stem assembly from a 535 control valve. These parts can be put on a wire wheel, although they don't look very usable. Put on a wire wheel as long as none of your sealing surfaces are worn. They can be reused, put new O-rings on, and you can reassemble them. With our new control valve, we supply an O-ring guide with all of our O-ring and gasket kits. The guide will look something like this, have a variety of O-rings in it. You can take your O-ring, these are actual sizes, and compare it to where that O-ring is located in your control valve. I've installed O-rings on most of my parts. I do have my low flow adjuster down here at the bottom. I'm going to have one located. I will use a good O-ring lube to place in the O-ring sealing area, install my O-ring, ready for reinstallation. So I have an O-ring on my low flow adjuster, on the top of my low flow adjuster, on my lower valve, on my high flow adjuster, and on my top cap. Once we have our parts cleaned up, our O-rings all replaced, we are now ready to reassemble the valve. We will start with the lower portion of the valve. We have our lower valve. We've replaced its O-ring. We'll put it in position. We'll then install on our 665 model the retainer. We will thread it into place. Now keep in mind, this does not need to be removed to repair that O-ring. We can simply pull the lower valve through and replace the O-ring. We can use an adjustable spanner wrench, thread the retainer in place, and tighten. We will then install the upper diaphragm housing, placing a new O-ring into its place, making sure that when we install the upper diaphragm housing, we line up the corresponding holes for the bolts in our cold water inlet to our diaphragm. Placing the diaphragm cover into position, making sure we're all lined up, we are then able to replace and tighten our cap screws to tighten the upper diaphragm housing to the main valve body. We tighten accordingly in a cross pattern tightening scheme similar to tightening a car tire. So tighten one side and then directly across the other side. With our upper diaphragm housing now installed, noting that I've only have 2 cap screws tightened, I would have my corresponding cap screws in place, tighten in a cross pattern configuration. I am now ready to install my stem and upper valve. Noting that the upper valve is permanently secured to the stem, that is done here at our factory and is a critical position for that valve. This valve should never be removed from the stem on disassembly. If it does become loose, you should contact your local Armstrong representative or Armstrong hot water group. We're now ready to assemble our diaphragm support disc and lower diaphragm chamber. I simply place the stem down through the center, allowing the threads to come right through my lower valve. I will reinstall my diaphragm disc. I then will install my diaphragm, noting that the bevel edge should face toward the outer end of the control valve. The diaphragm is installed, making sure that all the ends are nice and flat against our upper diaphragm housing. The diaphragm support disc is installed with the rounded edge facing the diaphragm, the flat edge facing the outside of the control valve. We then will put on our locking nuts and tighten to our support disc. The first one will go on, and we can use an 1 1/8" open end wrench and tighten to that support disc. We'll put on the second locking nut and tighten accordingly to the first lock nut. Once I have them locked down, I want to make sure that my diaphragm is nice. The edges of the diaphragm are nice and flush with the upper diaphragm housing. I can then go ahead and install my lower diaphragm housing, making sure my spring is in place. And replacing the diaphragm nuts and bolts accordingly. Again, tightening in a cross pattern configuration. With my diaphragm bolts completely secured and tightened in a cross pattern configuration, I am now ready to rebuild and reassemble the top portion of the valve. I will take my restrictor piece and thread it most of the way down. You want it sitting almost on top of that upper valve, the valve that was physically attached to the stem. You want it to a position that the top cap, when put in place, sits down nice and flush on top of your control valve. So I will thread this down the stem. I can utilize my high flow adjuster to make quicker operation of it. Once I have that lowered on the stem, I can then take my low flow adjuster, thread it into my top cap, noting that I have my O-ring in place, thread the low flow adjuster completely into my top cap until it stops. Once it stops, I can then place it over the top of my high flow adjuster and restrictor and put it into place. It'll snap down into position. I can line up my cap screws and tighten accordingly. Prior to reinstalling the control valve to our shell and tube exchanger, it's always good to replace the pressure relief valve located here on the bottom of the diaphragm housing. Use some good thread tape or sealant prior to the installation of the pressure relief valve. Place it in and tighten accordingly. We'll also want to replace the sealing surface on the front side of our control valve, our O-ring, which is the O-ring found in the O-ring gasket kit, along with the other O-rings that we replaced. Again, use a O-ring lube or silicone to hold it in place and give it extra seal. Place it in the groove for the O-ring, and then reinstall the O-ring accordingly. We now have our control valve completely rebuilt. We have our pressure relief valve in place. We now want to position our low flow adjuster and our high flow adjuster into starting position prior to our temperature adjustment. I can take my 13/16" box wrench. What I want to do is turn my low flow adjuster clockwise to a position that it stops. I then want to back it off so it's not binding. I now have my low flow adjuster into starting position. In that position, once I start adjustment, at my lowest flow, I'm going to be in its hottest set point at low flow. I then will take my high flow adjuster. I'll want to turn that counterclockwise to a position until I have roughly an 1/8 inch of travel, keeping in mind that water pressure will keep my high flow adjuster in position. I can take my adjusting wrench, depress, place it across, and depress down. The water pressure will pop that back up into position. With the two valves into position, I'm ready to start my temperature adjusting, knowing that at my lowest flow, I'm in my hottest position. At high flow, I'm in my coldest position. So at low flow, all I can do is cool it down. At high flow, all I can do is heat it up. But I know internally where those valves are placed. We've just completed the disassembly and reassembly of the 665 control valve, noting that we have 4 size heaters, our smallest unit being our 415 there on the end, our 535 unit, and then our largest unit, our 8120. The disassembly and reassembly is identical for all size heaters, with exception of the 8120. The 8120 is the only control valve that does have a 2-piece lower valve section. We have a stem and a lower plug valve. Other than that, the 415, 535, and 8120 are identical with internals, O-ring placement that we just demonstrated with our 665 control valve.